Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Nicole Etcheson. I'm the Alexander M. Bracken Professor in the Department of History here at Ball State, and my specialty is Civil War. Before we turn it over to the students and their presentation, I have a few thank yous. First to Dr. Scott Steffen and the Student History Conference Committee, who have done a tremendous amount of work, I think maybe more than they usually have to do to make this all work on the new Zoom world that we live in. I also want to thank Chuck Allen from Unified Technology, who gave me the run through on how to do this, and also to specify that if things get messed up, it is not Chuck's fault. I will take full responsibility. Most of all, I want to thank our students, AJ and Cayla and Sarah, for being here this morning and sharing their work with us, and to those of you in the audience who also are giving up your morning to be with us. First, I'm going to introduce the presenters. There's a Q&A function, so if you have questions as they are giving their presentation, feel free to put them in the question and answer function at any time. After they finish, I will make some summary comments, and we can open the floor to the questions that have come in. First, let me explain a little bit about what we are doing here. Cayla and AJ and Sarah were all students in the Honors 390 Civil War in Memory class that I taught last fall. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the class. It explores themes in the American memory of our Civil War. And the students read, discuss, watch a variety of materials. We looked at statues, we watched parts of movies, they read novels and poetry, most of it bad. And as an honors class, it is largely self-directed. I asked them to talk about the themes that they see in these works. And I divide the class into 4 sections. First, we do a little bit about the history of the war because, as you'll see, most of them are not history or social studies ed majors. Then we look at materials generated by white Northerners, then materials generated by white Southerners, and then African Americans and their memory of the war. So you're going to see those 3 sections reflected in these presentations: the memory of white Northerners, white Southerners, and African Americans. And so for this roundtable, I selected some of the best papers from each section of the course. So you're getting the creme de la creme of the honors course. Sarah Rozmin will give the first paper on the cost of the Civil War for white Northerners. Sarah is a junior here at Ball State, but she's originally from Terre Haute. She is majoring in social studies education with concentrations in history, geography, and government, and she's part of the Honors College. And she is looking forward to completing her senior thesis and student teaching next year. Cayla Harter wrote about how white Southerners crafted memory to justify their enslavement of African Americans. Cayla is a senior advertising major and French minor. She is originally from Wapakoneta. Did I say that correctly?
Wapakoneta.
Okay, Ohio. She works part-time at Bracken Library at the reference desk, and she's also secretary of Ball State's chapter of the American Advertising Federation, and she spends her free time with her dog, Lucy. What kind of dog?
She is a mutt, and I'm sure she'll try and show her face at some point today. She is a little notorious for that.
Okay, well, we've had Dr. Johnson's cat appear at the conference, so that's okay. AJ Koroly examines how African Americans use the religious concept of grace to temper the anger enslavement generated. AJ is a senior majoring in accounting with minors in economics and political science. And he said during class that he has a deep love of the United States tax code. So that's good. He's involved with the Accounting Club, the Federal Reserve Challenge Team, and the Politics in Media Club. He also works as a student assistant in the Department of Accounting and is a student member of the Indiana CPA Society. AJ has completed accounting internships in tax at Louis A. Epstein CPA and Associates Limited, Crow LLP, and will intern with Ernst & Young in summer 2021. He has received a job offer from Crow LLP, but has postponed his decision on the offer until he completes the Ernst & Young internship. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so before we get started, I'm just gonna share our presentation here, and then we can just jump right into it. Like Dr. Etcheson said, we're gonna go over the different perspectives, and we're gonna start with the Northern perspective. So without further ado, we can jump right in.
Alrighty, so the Northern perspective and legacy of the Civil War is basically a combination of the physical and mental fallout from serving and from the veterans of the Union side of the Civil War. And we'll talk a little bit about how that affects modern Northern citizens and culture. So the first and foremost, that Northern citizens and veterans specifically had to deal with was physical exhaustion and wounds. There was kind of a theme of mutiny and desertion, and this happened on both sides of the Civil War, mainly because no one thought the Civil War would last as long as it did. Excuse me. People thought it would last a few months, and soldiers' experiences didn't line up with expectations. They knew it was going to be awful, but they didn't expect it to continue for many years. Plus, when you're fighting on a war front, you're lacking basic necessities like food, water, sleep, and specifically hygiene during this time period. And it's really depicted in the 1991 film Gettysburg that we discussed in class. And Colonel Chamberlain gives this wonderful speech to motivate and rouse these men to action. It's used a lot as a examination of rhetoric, but we don't really know that happened, but we do know about these deserters and about these men who were so exhausted that they just wanted to go home. They just wanted some empathy, and they didn't expect their lives to be at the point that it was. And this exhaustion continued for many Union soldiers until either the end of the war or they were wounded or killed. And the main thing that many of us remember from learning about the Civil War in any class that you've taken, American history, specifically a Civil War class like you might take with Dr. Etcheson, is the amputation and other ailments that veterans suffered. Violence or injury is really a given during war. It's unlikely that you'll come out unscathed, but the Civil War was extra gory due to advancements in technology at the time, specifically mini bullets that would spin. They were more accurate than they were in the Revolutionary War, and they would splinter bone. They would cause much more damage inside the human body. And really the only way to help and save someone's life was to amputate. And amputation was also new at the time, but it saved a lot of people's lives, but it also left them with lifelong issues and deformities. And we can see in the image as an example of someone who lost both their arms in the Civil War. In Return of the Private, which we read in class, a little short story about a man named Edward Smith, who was a Union veteran, had to walk home from the front. He was left with bullet scars. He was deaf in one ear, and he would have been considered lucky at this time. So there are also much emotional exhaustion and wounds that Union veterans faced during this time. And this was really what lingers on today, is the ripple effect of these emotional stressors. A lot of veterans suffered from survivor's guilt. When during a war where hundreds of thousands of men has died, it's probably not hard to ask, why me? Why did I live? Why did I have to experience all this pain and all this gore that was happening? And what was known in the Civil War as soldier's heart. Today, we know this is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and just so many veterans were plagued with these issues, and these issues led to other things like addiction, domestic violence, things like that. And during a time where mental health was not only misunderstood, but it was hardly perceived. Veterans and their families were left to pick up the pieces on their own and try to move on with their lives. And this is depicted in both Return of the Private, when Edward Smith comes home and is trying to move on his life, and his wife is noticing, hey, something's wrong here, but I'm not sure I really want to bring it up. I know that Edward wants to move on with his life, wants to spend time with his kids, but something is clearly wrong here. And it's also shown very vividly in Geraldine Brooks's book March, which is a novel based on Little Women, and it's more of a depiction of Mr. March as he journeys through the Civil War and serves as a kind of reverend, but also at times is in active combat. And there's a point in which his wife comes to see him because he's sick and he's ill, and it's clear that he's ill not only because of the lack of hygiene, as we discussed earlier, but because he doesn't have the energy, the mental energy to fight this anymore. And his wife says, I wonder if I will ever see him smile again. And this is really one snapshot of the journey that these veterans had, and that these veterans brought home to their families, and that these families experienced. So in the North, that's really distinctive is there's a legacy of trauma from not necessarily before the Civil War, but the Civil War itself. And there's a lot of coping mechanisms and denial that have been passed down, in that, oh, we fought this battle, we were victorious, and now it's over. And we can mourn and we can cope and we can go on from there. Because as we know today, racism in the United States and racial equality was not achieved. And that's basically what the Civil War was fought over, was achieving racial equality, freeing the slaves, etc. And to admit that the Union failed, the Union won, but they still failed. To admit that would be very hard for not only the veterans of the Civil War and their children, but the many generations that have come afterward that still take pride in these soldiers and their family that served in the Civil War, that this Northern culture of, oh, we did it, we're morally superior on this front, things like that. And there's also there's that fear of admitting failure, and there's also the fear of facing shame that comes from that, because people have used this as an excuse. Well, my family fought for the North, so I don't have to recognize any of the troubles that African Americans are facing today. I don't have to really, my family did their time, my family did their contribution, and don't have to stick up for these people. And this is really depicted in Robert Lowell's poem For the Union Dead, in which he examines the legacy of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment and their commander, Colonel Robert Shaw. And I know that AJ will probably touch on this a little later with the monument in Massachusetts, but in Boston. And here in this poem, it's really not honoring the Union dead. It's not a coping thing. It's not a catharsis like some of the earlier poetry we read in this class. It's more of modern Northerners are compliant, and modern Northerners are complacent in that they have glorified these men and had these wonderful memories, but they haven't kept this momentum going, and they haven't done enough to achieve equality, and in essence haven't done justice to Colonel Robert Shaw and the veterans of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And that's really interesting because we still see this today, and we still see this kind of continuing. And given the mob that happened on January 6th, we see this shroud of complacency and of white Northerners. For some, it's being thrown off, and some are saying, "Oh, there's something that's a real problem here." And in terms of white supremacy, in terms of glorification of the Confederacy, and there's some people who are just wrapping the shroud of complacency tighter and saying, "Oh, well, this isn't a Northern problem. This isn't a problem of people that fought for the Union. This isn't a problem for our states and our families." And in essence, that's not exactly true.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit on the Southern perspective and how they kind of justified slavery and the war, from the treatment of slaves being almost childlike or infantilizing them, or the debate over how slaves were treated, whether they were treated like family or if they were treated poorly, was a hot debate during the Civil War, and kind of looking forward to reaffirming these beliefs even today with false narratives in the history that we've written. So one thing that we noticed through a lot of the works that we read were that slaves were portrayed very childlike and unable to take care of themselves. And this was sort of the white Southerners' way of saying, "Oh, look, we're taking care of these people. They can't take care of themselves. They need us." And that's how a lot of times they justified keeping slaves, that they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves. And this was seen prominently when we watched scenes from Gone with the Wind with characters like Big Sam and Prissy especially. Prissy was very, very childlike in many of her mannerisms, even though she was an adult. And I think this definitely shows that almost the idea of a white savior complex, like they're doing good for these people, even when they're really not. But it was their way in their mind of justifying, and that's kind of how they tried to justify it to the Northerners as well. And they played this off as a way of, "Oh, look at these white Northerners not understanding, trying to come in and change our system when we're really trying to do good." And they use characters like Big Sam in Gone with the Wind, who had he was happy. He talked very politely to Scarlett. They showed that as a way to say, like, "Oh, look, they're happy. They have no issue with this. They don't mind," which really wasn't the case. But this was one of the arguments that was very heavily made during the Civil War and even after. And we see this come across a lot in films like Gone with the Wind and others based around that time. Another main argument that they made was that most of them were treated like family, or the slaves were treated like family by their white masters. We see this especially in Nashville 1864, which was one of the novels that we read throughout the semester. And we see this with the main family in the book. And you see Stephen, who is the main character, and Dink, who is one of the family slaves who's around the same age as Stephen. You see Stephen saying, "Oh, me and Dink grew up together. were like brothers. And this was a way that they tried to make it again seem like, oh, it wasn't really that bad. They were given a roof over their head. They were given food. But you can also see a little bit in 1864 with this novel that even though from the white perspective of Stephen, that, oh, they're treated like family, you also get the sense that characters like Dink don't really have a choice. He goes along with Stephen, and Stephen gives him the sense that he has a choice, but he really doesn't. Like, it doesn't occur to Stephen that Dink can't tell him no, that he can't walk away whenever he wants to. And that was another big thing is, especially with white Southerners, they use the argument a lot that we're treating them well, so why would they want to leave? But really, it wasn't the case. Or they use the argument that only large plantations really mistreated slaves during the time, which we have historical records that say otherwise, but this is still an argument that you hear occasionally today. But yes. And so one thing that really goes along with all of these is that we still have these arguments today with that the Southerners were not the ones who started the aggression. It was the North, and that the South wasn't doing anything wrong, and that the war was fought for state rights. Now, the state rights that were mainly in question were states' rights to have slaves, but that was very popular within the Southern narrative that it was not over slavery, it was over states' rights. And that going back on those, the slaves being treated like children, and that they were happy and the white masters were doing them a favor. And we see this still playing out in racist beliefs today and in manifestos such as Dylann Roof's. He cited a lot of these old Southern beliefs. And it's kind of become a justification for this hatred that we see. And with Confederate sympathizers, or even the growing movement of white supremacists that we see, the number of Confederate battle flags that were seen at the Capitol riots in January, which is what this image is from. I think these narratives have really fed into the idea that maybe South wasn't wrong in some people's minds, and that's what's causing them to bring back uses of the Confederate battle flag and so on. And it's definitely something that we have to look at and see, okay, why are these people still using these arguments that have been misproven, and what can we do to stop acts of hates like that of Dylann Roof's in Charlotte at the African American church, or that of those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th.
Hello, we're going to be talking about the African American perspective and their response to the Civil War. So from the African American perspective, we have an image down below of President Obama in Charleston, South Carolina, at his eulogy for Reverend Clementa Pinckney. And this was after the Dylann Roof shooting that took place in the Charleston African American church. And within his speech, he really mentions the Song of Amazing Grace. And this kind of captures, this song and its lyrics capture the understanding of grace and its use within the African American community as a tool to move forward. So we have this idea within the African American community right after the Civil War, and even to this day, of trying to balance these opposing concepts of grace and anger. So it kind of led to these research questions of such as like, how do African Americans find a balance between the two? Because grace and anger, especially on a fundamental level at first glance, are so, such counters to each other and contrasts, that is there really a middle ground? And then simultaneously going along with that, we have the second question of like, is there a need to balance the opposing ideas? Is the anger justified in and of itself, or is the grace justified in and of itself? So looking first at this grace aspect of the African-American response, there's many different definitions of grace, such as like courteous goodwill, refinement of movement. We could spend a whole webinar in and of itself going over the many terms of for grace. However, I think President Obama in that eulogy for Reverend Pinckney really kind of encaptures what grace means to the African American community when he says that grace is the free and benevolent favor of God. So it's kind of this understanding in having, a grasp of what's going on around you, not necessarily forgiving it, but accepting that that's what happened, remembering it, moving forward. And we see this forgiveness but not forgetting aspect of the African American response while utilizing grace through two really large figures within the African American community. First, we have Booker T. Washington, and we see his kind of utilization of grace in his dedication of Robert Gould Shaw monument in 1897. And Sarah talked a little bit about Robert Gould Shaw and how he was essentially the commanding officer of the 54th Massachusetts, an all African-American regiment within the Civil War. And Mr. Washington states in that dedication that he would not have us, when he's talking about Robert Gould Shaw, he says he, as in Robert Gould Shaw, would not have us dwell long on the mistakes, the injustice, and the criticism of the days. So he's really trying to lift up this kind of commentary on how we shouldn't forget the Civil War and the injustices of slavery. However, we should work together as one nation, Black and white, to move forward to create a better country. And Booker T. Washington and many of his other speeches and writings really had this philosophy of the African American people utilizing and having access to the economic resources that white people do, and that white people simultaneously shouldn't prevent African American people from having access to those resources, because there's this kind of synergy that can take place between the two people if we work together. And then moving forward, we also have Frederick Douglass, who in his 1871 Decoration Day speech has a really, really great quote, kind of emphasizing the forgiveness but not forgetting aspect. So he says, "I am no minister of malice. I would not strike the fallen. I would not repel the repentant. But may my right hand forget her cunning and my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I forget the difference between the parties to that terrible prostitute and bloody conflict. Sorry." So it's really just kind of looking, once again, we're remembering, we can't forget that, the Southerners were fighting for slavery, and we can't forget that the Northerners were fighting against slavery. And we can't forget the whole turmoil and trials of slavery, which for Frederick Douglass, as a former slave, an escaped slave, he experienced firsthand. But at the same time, we need to find a way to move forward while also remembering the past, because it does play a pivotal role. As we all know, history has a pivotal role on the present and the future actions of people. So on the opposite side, or what some would deem the opposite side of this response, we have the African-American kind of anger. And clearly this arises from countless injustices, primarily slavery, but we also see it with post-Reconstruction, during Reconstruction, this kind of, Sarah briefly commented on it, this kind of false promise of equality. Like, what exactly was or should have been the outcome of the Civil War? For some people, some in the North, like once again, like Sarah mentioned, there was just this kind of idea of, well, we freed the slaves and that's enough. But then again, what really is freedom if you're kind of just left to your own devices with no kind of help or anything? And even in some cases, there was this kind of push down, especially we saw with Jim Crow laws and everything. So needless to say, there were countless injustices where there is this justified anger that exists to this day, even over different injustices that are still occurring. So first aspect of this anger is we have an external anger. So we could see this in Nicole Hannah-Jones. She wrote the 1619 Project, but specifically in class, we looked at her article on reparations. And then Leron Bennett Jr., we looked at one of his pieces which was titled "The Most Famous Act in U.S. History Never Happened." So Nicole Hannah-Jones really comments in her reparations piece about how there is this kind of imbalance between freedom for African Americans in necessarily like equality between African Americans and white people. So she looks at numerous, economic numbers, statistics to show that African Americans are worse off. She comments on how there's this kind of aspect of when Lincoln freed the slaves, he really didn't do enough. And then we also see this in Leron Bennett Jr. So the most famous act that he's talking about is really Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and how he really didn't free the slaves and he was more just doing it as a political move. And this really comments on this external anger against kind of this white savior philosophy that some people have, where both Jones and Bennett really are commenting on how, we need to, from a historical perspective, in a modern perspective, really think about African Americans as helping themselves in certain ways and how they are, clearly sufficient of, not only freeing themselves from slavery, but also kind of lifting themselves up in this current environment as long as they're given the equality that they deserve. And then counter to the external anger, we have this internal anger. So first we can see Kendrick Lamar as an example, and there's an image of him on the bottom right. He's known for writing many songs relating to the plight of African Americans. Some of his songs are uplifting, some of them kind of hit close to home for some people in terms of highlighting injustices that maybe some artists are a little afraid of commenting on. But the song we looked at specifically in class was his song, "The Blacker the Berry." And in this song, he really comments on seeing himself as a hypocrite in terms of himself being, upset by certain injustices, such as primarily the Trayvon Martin case. However, he himself has been put in situations where he has had to kill or hurt his fellow African Americans. So there's this kind of internal sense of dread and hypocrisy, maybe within the African American community, that he's trying to highlight. And his lyrics really sparked a lot of controversy, especially within the Black community, because some people saw it as him kind of attacking his own community. But he clearly thought this was a way to spotlight this internal anger and kind of maybe the thought process going behind many people within the community. And then we have Caroline Randall Williams, and she kind of touches almost like the Southern perspective. So Southerners, like we mentioned, they kind of have this need, or not necessarily a need, but this conflict of trying to honor their ancestors while also, moving forward with a world where clearly what their ancestors did, fighting for slavery, having slaves, wasn't okay. And Caroline Randall Williams is touching on kind of this, belief almost that the very existence of certain African American people, specifically those who had sexually exploited ancestors like Caroline Randall Williams has, it's a representation and kind of this monument to the injustices faced. So there's this internal anger for Black people specifically. And Caroline Randall Williams specifically states this when she says, "I have rape-colored skin," because their ancestors were sexually exploited. So there's almost this internal anger over the very existence of Miss Williams is kind of showcases the horrors of what took place in the past. So finally, we have this kind of balancing of grace and anger. We're going to try to answer that question that we posed. And we can see that a balance can be found in the movie Glory, primarily, this is done by directing anger in this internal doubt externally to a certain type of problem. So in this specific movie, the Glory, we're following, these African American troops, and they're trying to direct their anger in what could be stated as like quote unquote productive way. They're trying to prove they're strong and they're brave. They're taking their internal doubts and the anger they have internally and externally against, the South, their own kind of feelings of maybe inadequacy with the way they've been treated. And they're utilizing that to fight against this external threat to try to obtain, I guess, a deeper, meaning for what they're doing. And then additionally, we see kind of this literary source of Tayimba Jess's poem, where he follows the character of Blind Tom, which is based on a real historical figure. And Blind Tom has many reasons to be angry. He's blind, which obviously can create many feelings of anger for someone. And then he's also basically been paraded around the South, being forced to play by his masters for Southern soldiers in Southern war camps. So, I mean, he's clearly has a very unfortunate situation where he's essentially has no freedom and is being forced to not just play for no money really, but also being forced to play for the same people that have put him in bonds and kept him in this cycle. But despite these many reasons to be angry, Blind Tom in and of himself doesn't necessarily reflect this anger. Instead, he uses this gift to reach beyond the horrors and find beauty in what could even be described as grace. He's really looking to move forward and not obviously forget the trials that he's going through, but try to use them as motivation to, find a deeper meaning for his craft in life. And one of the most prevailing quotes from that story in that poem, series of poems by Jess, is "We're all one wave of notes in the dark gospel of the universe." And clearly Blind Tom, even though he is blind, and even though he does face all these injustices and has reasons to be angry, through his utilization of grace in balancing the anger, he has what I think can be described as a deeper view of the realities of the world, in the terms of that we all are just kind of a function of the universe. And we do have a role to play with each other and among each other. And there's really no reason for this strife to be taking place. And that was the last slide we had.
So I'm doing the novice thing of talking with when I'm muted. Thank you so much, all of you. So AJ, can you stop screen sharing?
Yep.
All right, then. So we have the Q&A function. If people want to put questions in that, I have a few comments, and then I have some questions, but I think we'd really love to have questions from the people who are out there in cyberspace. I have to point out that the poetry that Sarah and AJ chose to highlight in the presentations was not the bad poetry. I would never say that Robert Lowell or Tayimba Jess are bad poets, but I do say that we did read some not so great, but pertinent poetry. Francis Miles Finch's The Blue and the Gray was perhaps not on the level with Tayimba Jess or Robert Lowell. So this is one of the great things about an honors course is I just give them the material and they do what they want with it and they have the insights into it. So we just have the basic commonality that we're talking about memory and we're talking about the Civil War. And the discussions are very wide ranging, as we've seen with these papers. So Sarah has talked about exhaustion and PTSD. Cayla has talked about enslavement and the ways that white Southerners found to justify enslavement as a good thing, and then that carries over into the post-war justifications of white supremacy that we see coming up all the way to the modern day. And AJ has talked about this balance in the African American community, or this tension between very natural feeling of anger and this African American Christianity and the doctrine of grace that tempers that anger. So in my comments, I wanted to concentrate on just a couple of common themes that I saw in the different approaches that they talk. As some of us who have read the work of historians such as Michael Woods know, the history of emotion is big these days. People are writing, and Woods has written a book about emotion and the pre-Civil War period and how it contributes to bringing on the Civil War. So I see a lot of different kinds of emotions in Sarah and Cayla and AJ's work. Sarah talks not just about the physical weariness of the war, but the sadness that comes with this physical trauma. She mentions the deserters who want empathy, that they have already served, their service is supposed to be over with, and yet the army won't let them go. And so Chamberlain is depicted in the movie Gettysburg. Colonel Chamberlain is depicted as successfully incorporating those deserters into the 20th Maine by showing empathy for their situation and willingness to represent their cause higher up in the army. Sarah talks about the survivor's guilt that is part of the PTSD phenomenon, that there's been this horrific war that is still is the single bloodiest event in US history, and that having survived that, there's a certain guilt that comes with that. And Sarah mentioned the idea of soldier's heart, the depression, the 19th century term for the depression that veterans felt, and the mental health issues. But I also like the fact, as Sarah talks about, even a sense of defeat, even though we think of the Northerners as the victors. They won the war, they freed the slaves, but there's a sense of shame, Sarah said, of defeat, because part of the cause for which they fought and which they are priding themselves on is having freed the slaves. And yet, as Cayla tells us, the white South is very successful in reasserting white supremacy and taking away, to a certain extent, that Northern victory. Again, I see emotion in what Cayla is talking about when she says that white Southerners, as depicted in the novel Nashville, as depicted in the movie Gone with the Wind, try to use family as a way to excuse enslavement and to avoid being honest about the power relationships. And Cayla points to the relationship in the novel Nashville between Stephen, the white protagonist, and the slave boy he has grown up with. And there is this affection, but as they go searching for Stephen's father, who has been wounded in the Confederate Army, the power relationship emerges. Dink wants to turn back, Stephen wants to find his father, and then the tragic result in the novel is that Dink dies, and it is, to a certain extent, it's Stephen's fault. He made Dink do something Dink did not want to do. And I also thought it was interesting, Cayla talked about white Southern emotions, that a sense of grievance, that here they were just taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves and who were perfectly happy. Another emotion that white Southerners are projecting onto African Americans. They're perfectly happy as slaves. And these bad Yankees come and start this nasty war because they want to disrupt this paternalistic, happy relationship between Southern whites and Southern blacks. And that these justifications come down into our own time with someone like Dylan Roof, who uses this kind of rhetoric to justify a horrific act of violence against innocent African Americans in a church. And that sense of grievance has turned not just against the North, but even against African Americans who we would say are white Southerners victims. But Dylan Roof has turned this around into a sense of the white South being victimized. Which brings me to the emotions that I find in AJ's paper, which of course are the two huge emotions of anger. And I think AJ did a great job of breaking down, it's not just the kind of simplistic anger that we would all recognize, that if you have been exploited and your people have been exploited for hundreds of years, that there is anger over the whippings, anger over the murders, anger over the work without payment, anger over the sexual violence. That's the kind of anger that we immediately think about. But AJ also talks about anger and division within the African American community when someone like Kendrick Lamar criticizes the African American community in his songs and is then criticized for not fully supporting the community, or someone like Carolyn Randall Williams who talks about the internalized anger of knowing that you have the blood and the lighter skin color and the genetic material of the oppressors within you. And then AJ talks about the examples of grace that have been one way in which the African American community has responded. So after the horrific violence at the Charleston AME Church, we have President Obama talking about God's grace, about forgiveness. And Blind Tom, who, even though he's exploited for his musical talent, is able to talk about the universality, that we're all one, we are all notes in God's universe. Then the second theme, and it's I think already been there in my comments, that I think Sarah and Cayla and AJ have given us, is that Civil War memory is always a memory about the racial issues in our society. Sarah talks about how Northerners feel a sense of shame that they didn't quite accomplish what they take credit for accomplishing. But then they also wrap themselves in kind of complacency. We freed the slaves, so we don't have any race problems. Martin Luther King Jr. begged to differ, and that was very controversial in the North. And Cayla, of course, has talked about the reality of white supremacy, that white Southerners are trying to erase, and actually trying to turn into a dialogue about how they are the oppressed race, how they have done so much for African Americans, and how nobody seems to appreciate their paternalist care. And of course, with AJ, you see how the African American community has tried to work out this relationship of being a minority in a country that has long accepted these narratives, these Southern narratives, and balance that struggle with systemic racism with the need to live in this larger community of the United States. So, and then I'll finally say that I see all three of of you working through how to apply what we talked about race and memory and the Civil War to the events that happened after the class was over on January 6th. So I see we do have some questions in the Q&A. So we'll take first, we have one from Dr. Felker Cantor. Thanks for a great panel. So he has a question for everyone. How were the three different memories of the Civil War you described debated, contested, and reconciled at different moments in time?
I can kick it off. So I think, you know, we were seeing a contested, I guess, debate between these different memories, essentially right after the Civil War was completed. We see this, each specific perspective we looked at, there was different views basically on what the Civil War was about. What was the outcome of the Civil War supposed to be? Like we mentioned a lot, the Northerners, some of them were fighting just to free the slaves. Some of them were fighting for equality. African Americans, those who fought and even those who didn't fight, and then the slaves themselves were looking for this kind of deeper equality. The 40 acres and the meal story is really big, trying to find this kind of economic foothold to kind of reach an equality. And then the Southerners, of course, they have these feelings of resentment. They certainly don't want to, I mean, they're giving up their slaves, but they're basically being forced to do so. They're defeated. They don't really want to, they don't really want to give up what they're giving up, but they're doing it because obviously they don't have the power anymore. So there's this big kind of contestment between these different perspectives of what the war was about in terms of moving into the Reconstruction period and then during Reconstruction as to like, how much should we be doing? What is equality? What is enough to provide this even foothold? And then we kind of see this pushback of the Southerners really obviously kind of leading the charge against that equality pushback. And when we see Jim Crow come in and everything, that is really evident. And then the establishment of the KKK. And so I would say that it's immediately contested, basically right after the Civil War is completed, is kind of this first instance where we see the perspectives being debated.
So I think you can also see it come time with different civil rights movements throughout the year, or whenever there's sort of a more push for equal rights, especially for African Americans. You have groups like the Daughters of the Confederacy or the groups like the KKK who try to put out different perspectives to make themselves look better as a way to keep equal rights from going through. That's when you see the monuments specifically going up. A lot of the monuments weren't put up immediately after the Civil War. They were put up during civil rights movements by groups like the Daughters of the Confederacy, to try and remake this narrative, like I kind of mentioned earlier, that the slavery wasn't as bad as they made it out to be. So I can definitely see that being debated and contested, especially during moments of civil rights unrest and stuff.
I definitely agree with that, Cayla. There's a huge re-examination of conscience that happens every time a group within the United States brings up lack of equal rights. And that's because there's this story that we are told being white in America. And I do notice that all of us on this panel are white, that we are sold this kind of uncomplicated history of America being self-made and self-forged, and that there's nothing wrong with us whatsoever. And at certain moments in time, especially when people are fighting for civil rights, that is directly contested and that is directly debated. And the Civil War is a huge part of the fight for civil rights and a huge aspect of American history that is depicted in varying ways, and as we saw today. And a lot of times what you learn in school and what you learn at home isn't necessarily the truth. And you kind of have to go on I say soul searching, but it's not exactly that, to find the memory of the Civil War that somewhere, in between all of these is the truth. And that's very important that we examine all of these and examine them and reconcile them and kind of try to find the history within them. Because while it's all based on historical fact, it's reliant on emotion, as Dr. Etcheson said earlier, and reliant on the thoughts and feelings of people coming out of the Civil War. So every time these feelings are brought up, we have to re-examine them.
Okay, thank you. So our next question is from Dr. Stefan, and it's kind of in Cayla's area, but I think all three of you might have thoughts on it. Has there been a reckoning about slavery's past among white Southerners in recent years in response to the Dillon Roof shooting and the controversy over the monuments? Or do we still have a lost cause mindset in the South?
I think it's definitely split, having looked at some of the recent events like Dillon Roof or the monuments or the Capitol riots. I think you definitely see those who are realizing you've had some government officials in the South vote to take down statues and monuments. So I think there is that little bit, it's a slow process. I don't think that it's all the way done yet, or it may never be. But I do think there is a little bit of a reckoning per se, or a rethinking or a realization of what's going on and what these monuments and these different mindsets represent. Of course, you still have those who it's going to be a lost cause. You're not going to get through to them. You saw the people in the examples I gave with the Capitol riots, which is a very, very recent event. That shows that there are still people, even with everything going on, that are going to still try to justify it in a way. So I think we're working towards it, but it's still a long way to go.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of there being that semblance of reckoning, I think we have seen that because after the massacre, South Carolina voted to take down the Confederate flag from their capital. At the same time, though, there was people there protesting that move. But I just think we are seeing these certain developments. We also saw recently Mississippi redesign their state flag. So we're seeing these changes, which some people may say like aren't like, blanking on a word, but like valuable in terms of maybe they don't like actually put in change. They're more just like, aesthetic type of changes, but there is this reckoning. But I have a hard time saying there will be complete reckoning, because there is this kind of balance between your ancestral past in this current, and it's so hard. Like hypothetically, if I found out my grandfather, well, not my grandfather, my great grandfathers, it's like that's a little too recent, owned slaves. I could acknowledge that was wrong, but at the same time, can I specifically come out and say like he's a terrible person, which is kind of what we're seeing with this balance, which is why I don't know if we're going to see a complete reckoning, because we read an article of this man who owned a barbecue restaurant, and his father was racist. Basically, he had segregation policies for his restaurant, and he's made changes. He's taken the flag down from the restaurant. He's obviously opened the restaurant up to all different types of customers, but he hasn't specifically called out his father for being the racist that he was. which for most people, I think would say that there isn't a complete reckoning. But at the same time, how are you supposed to ask someone basically to admit or state that their ancestor, who basically is one of the reasons why they're here today, was basically a not so good person?
Plus, when you have organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy and other Southern-based organizations and places pushing this mindset of lost cause, not only in public, but in education and in curriculums. Being a social studies education major, I kind of think about that a little bit more than other people, but just it's still being taught to the next generation and isn't recognized as across the spectrum as being incorrect or as being wrong or as being inaccurate. And I don't think that we'll have a reckoning until that decision across the spectrum is made.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we had a pretty vigorous discussion about the barbecue sauce article last semester. I think one of your classmates said that was one of the subjects that people in the class most disagreed about, whether the son who inherited the barbecue restaurant had an obligation to repudiate his father's racism, or whether that was an act of sort of family betrayal that shouldn't be expected of him. All right, so we have another question here from Dr. Stefan, which is mainly aimed at Sarah, but I think AJ and Cayla can contribute. When Union vets returned home and lived through the 19th century, were these disfigured and depressed men celebrated, pitied, or marginalized in their communities?
I think they were all three. Because honestly, remember, a community is full of different kinds of people, and they're all going to have different opinions and different ways of viewing people who are disfigured and depressed, as you put it. There were just all different types of views on these people. Some people saw them as heroes because they had served. Some people saw them as pitiable because honestly, that's a very natural reaction to have when you think of someone in this day and age in the 19th century where you had to physically work for a living. It's not like today where you had most of people in office jobs. These were people who were laborers. These were people who worked with their hands, and especially when you had physical ailments and amputations, it made life extremely difficult. And people in these communities would have recognized that. Also, as I discussed earlier, people didn't understand mental illness like we do today. They thought it was a personal fault. They thought it meant that you were a result of, they thought it was a personal fault generally. And sometimes the fact that these people were veterans outweighed that and outweighed these stigmatizations. And in some communities, they probably didn't. And with some people, and within a community, you might have very different reactions depending on the family, depending on the individual person. So that's a very interesting question, but I do think it's a mix of all three.
Cayla or AJ, do you have something you want to contribute?
I think Sarah pretty much nailed it on that one. It really would have depended on probably the severity of their injuries and whatnot, and also just the community they were in. I mean, everyone's going to have a different reaction to a member of their community or a loved one coming home and having these disfigurements or PTSD or depression, especially like Sarah said, mental illness wasn't really taken into account at the time. So it really would depend on the community and the individuals themselves.
I think part of it is we can make connections to more modern cases where we see veterans come over here and in instances face poor treatment, whether it be like medical or just, not having a job or being left on the street. So we kind of see how there's this combination of all three kind of treatment factors even today. And I think part of that is it kind of divvies in not necessarily more of like political, well, not political, but like a different direction necessarily. But in America, there's this kind of, the war fervor versus like after you're done with the war. And you kind of see that even with individuals, like while you're playing a sport, you're having fun. Well, maybe not having fun, but you're focused, you're get ingrained in what you're doing. And then after the fact, you might like go and forget about it and read a book. And I think that kind of is a kind of really, really, really watered down metaphor of kind of how some veterans are treated. And we see that. And I think this case may have even been heightened in terms of the Civil War, because like we mentioned, there was this belief going into the war, oh, this is going to be a few weeks, we're going to go and kill some Yankees, and then we're going to come back and we're going to have some sweet tea and go back to the plantation. However, clearly that wasn't the case. It was a long ingrained war, a lot of death, the bloodiest conflict. So at the end of the day, there was a lot of people who fought or who didn't fight, those on the home front, because they went through, a lot of trials in terms of, property being destroyed, possibly rationing. So there's this kind of belief of, well, I wipe my hands clean, I'm going to forget about this. And obviously, when you're forgetting about the turmoils of war, and trying to put that in the back of your mind and moving forward, one of the consequences of that is you're kind of leaving the veterans who fought in that war out to dry. But at the same time, there was celebrations. Even FDR had an event where you're celebrating the North in the Southern troops sacrifices that they made. So definitely, I think Sarah covered it well with all three aspects being entwined. And I think it really can relate to even modern examples that we see.
Okay, thank you. Well, we still have time if people in the audience want to put in more questions, but now I can pick up with the questions that I had thought of. And actually, the questions I'm going to ask are not the ones that I wrote out before the panel, but the ones I've been scribbling down here as you guys have been talking. And first, the issue of education that Sarah mentioned. So I'm always curious to hear what students have encountered before you got to college in the way, how were you educated about the Civil War? Do you feel like you got a particular narrative about the Civil War, a Northern one, one that had African-American influences, or was it the sort of lost cause narrative Cayla has talked about? Or maybe they just didn't teach Civil War in your schools at all.
I would say for me particularly, I think I very much got the white Northern perspective. Midwestern Ohio, you don't get much, but we really didn't touch on the Civil War all that much from what I can remember. And when we did, it was mainly the white Northern perspective. And we really did not touch on either the Southern or African-American perspective at all either. It was focused on the battles, and that was pretty much it.
Yeah, and in grade school, elementary, like middle school area, from Wisconsin. So once again, more of that northern view. But in that lower level, we didn't really talk about it as much. It was more, looking at battles and kind of just briefly skimming over it. But in high school, I took AP US History, which is more of like a nationalized version of the curriculum. So you kind of got this what I thought was a relatively neutral breakdown of everything that was occurring. But as Cayla said, there is this kind of emphasis, in like northern good, southern bad, which, you know, is like for the most part true, but at the same time you lose kind of, I think, an overall perspective of what's going on, and maybe it tweaks certain images to make certain things look better, or make it so the North seemed like they did more like post-war than what they maybe really did.
I had similar experiences when it was very kind of skimmed over. We discussed what was important to know for a curriculum, but we really looked at it in a very clinical way, in that we weren't really examining the viewpoints of the North and South. And we were more looking at, oh, the North was industrialized and the South wasn't. And it was clear that the North would be able to ride out a longer war and things like that. But we really didn't examine the perspectives of Northerners and Southerners. Like a discussion of Uncle Tom's Cabin was, why is this important? Why is it highlighted in my book as the vocabulary? It wasn't, we weren't looking into these really, we weren't looking at the emotional fervor, and we weren't looking at the different historical viewpoints of these people. And I think that it's really important to understanding the Civil War. I think I understand the Civil War much more now from having Dr. Etcheson's class, and even understanding the legacy of the Civil War. It makes me understand Reconstruction way better. And that's the thing, is that when the Civil War is taught in such a clinical way, because personally, I think teachers and schools and administrations and all the way up the chain, people are fearful of starting controversy because it still ignites controversy today. But people come out of school and graduate high school and maybe don't even encounter experiences like this in college, where they have the opportunity to learn about these things more fully and have a totally different opinion and different views on the Civil War than the truth, or what is actually much more complicated than people really understand.
Okay, well, the next question that I scribbled down when you guys were talking was Sarah's point again about we're all white. We did not have any African-American students in that class. And those of us who teach Civil War know that it tends to not attract very many African-American students. And in fact, I didn't use it last semester when you were all in the class, but in the past, I've used an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates about why African-Americans don't take Civil War history. So I wonder if it relates. Well, I'd like to get all of your thoughts on that. And I did wonder, when Cayla mentioned battles, that insofar as the Civil War history that you've been taught is this litany of battles and generals, do you, and again, this is going to be a group of white people speculating on this, but do you see in what we talk about with Civil War and the memory of the Civil War ways in which this is just not going to be attractive to African-American students?
Well, I think that the African-American perspective of the Civil War, and even before the Civil War, is grossly neglected. And that's why I admire the 1619 Project very much, because it examines these perspectives in American history and highlights them in curriculum. versus most US curriculums don't touch perspectives that aren't white perspectives. And if those people aren't represented, then why in the world would they want to take a class that's all about their suffering, and that the Civil War is, and about and I'm sure that based on our experiences in high school and curriculum, that it's already been ignored in K through 12. And then you add the factors of you have all these different people coming together in college, and I'm sure that there's a little bit of fear there in countering these controversial opinions in a Civil War class where people are arguing for the Southern perspective, like Cayla talked about, because that's what they learned. And if there's not a focus on African American perspectives, and there's not and it's not represented in the classroom, then I don't blame them for not wanting to take that class.
Yeah, kind of jumping off that point with Sarah, I think a lot of it boils down to why would you want to take a class where the group that was predominantly hurt by the events not represented? Like African Americans were still dealing with the trauma of slavery even today, and racism. So why would they want to take a class where they're ignored essentially, and their part and their contributions are ignored, which is what we predominantly got in K through 12, like Sarah said. So I think it boils down a lot to that. They don't feel represented, and they don't realize that it'll be a little bit different in courses like Dr. Etcheson's, where we do get that perspective and we spend a lot of time listening to their stories. So I think that is a big thing that we need to work on, especially with grade school and into high school and early colleges. We need to make sure that the Civil War was about slavery and African Americans and their rights. So why don't we focus on that more rather than the big battles and the interesting parts of it?
Yeah, we're just kind of stuck in a feedback loop with it. Like obviously in the past, and you could even make the argument for in some cases now, the African American perspective on certain issues has been dampened. But there's this kind of item of like, if we don't get more involvement in one way or the other, that perspective is going to remain less prevalent, which obviously I don't have the past history of, like when I'm looking at this, I don't have the direct connection to some of these trials and injustices, you could say. So I can understand being, put off by not wanting to be a part of that. But at the same time, only through more involvement can we really kind of capture that perspective. And I like what Cayla said about how there is through curriculum, especially with Dr. Etcheson's class, there is material out there that can be utilized, which I think can draw in even more perspectives, which as we see in all the history classes here at Ball State or wherever we are, perspective and really the humans themselves, the individuals, are what drive history and what give us a more complete view of the context and what actually is taking place.
I think this is an interesting point, particularly AJ and Cayla have made, that if you don't, there are good reasons to not want to take a class where you think the narrative is going to be driven by things that ignore your perspective. But on the other hand, if you don't engage with that, then that narrative just keeps going forward to new generations. So of course, I have to ask you, Cayla used an image from the Capitol riots on January 6th. And I know that when I watched the security videotape, what I saw was They smash the window, and practically the first person in is carrying a Confederate flag. And I am still thinking through the emotions of dismay and sorrow for that moment. So what are your thoughts about, I guess one question that I'm grappling with is seeing the Confederate flag in the Capitol building, which never happened during the Civil War. Is that mean that we failed, that the Southern narrative is triumphant, or is this just the kind of backlash of a dying movement?
So I'm taking Dr. Blackwell's Norse mythology class this semester, and one of the things we've been talking about is the Capitol riots and the appropriation of North culture within that. And I think really, especially with the Confederate flags and stuff, we're seeing not so much a rise in white supremacy, but a vocalness with it.
Mhm.
They've always been there, but I think definitely within the past 4 years and some of the talking points that have been made and the advancements in media and stuff, they feel more vocal and open to talk about it. So I think this narrative is getting spread more because they are having an easier way to reach more people, if that makes sense. Like with social media and stuff, they feel emboldened to speak out on their beliefs because there's no consequences on social media versus if you say something incredibly racist in person, there's a chance you're going to get punched. But so I think that is part of it. Like it is such a grappling point of going back and forth of, is this lost cause narrative getting put more and more forward, or are these people just becoming more emboldened with their beliefs and don't feel like they have to hide them behind words or screens anymore? Like if they feel they can go out and speak, like obviously seeing the Confederate flag in the Capitol was a huge shock, and they were everywhere. So I think it's just something we are really going to have to work towards, making sure this narrative doesn't keep spreading, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yes, it makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's this past year has made the history books for so many reasons. But I think the mob at the Capitol was very interesting because it's significant of a turning point of our nation, and we can our population and our values can reflect a change in that we as the American populace can decide that this is not acceptable, this is not representative of who we are, and we are determined to make sure this radical ideology is combated and that truth prevails or whatever. Or we can continue being complacent and continue kind of ignoring the problem, and as Cayla said, let it spread, as radicalization on the internet makes it easier for white supremacist groups to continue. And yeah, I think that it's very interesting and terrifying because we as the United States population, as an entire group of people, have to make the decision to speak out and nip this in the butt. Well, not in the butt, it's been continuing for many years, but throw off those shrouds of complacency that I talked about earlier and decide, okay, this is not acceptable, this is not what America means, or we can continue to ignore the problem and hope it'll go away and let it spread.
Yeah, I think I think it kind of is more of like this, not a dying breath, because it's never going to go away. I think it's really hard to get rid of a certain ideology. Just look at the war on terrorism is kind of something I compare it to. It's not necessarily the direct example, but we see, you're trying to remove this mindset, and it's so hard because mindsets obviously can change and be adapted. Not only do we see that with the Southerners, not only embracing the lost cause, manipulating kind of the rationale behind the war to kind of justify what they did. We also see it with kind of how the interpretation even of the flag itself has been updated. So obviously I can't, we don't know the mindset of these people, and most of them are probably, not the most sane people doing this. But when they're holding those flags, for them, that it almost seems like they must have, manipulated that iconography to kind of represent more of maybe like an individual right or states' rights. And then, you have that whole other, like, it's just so hard to get rid of because it's been manipulated. So I think the whole event, I guess, was kind of like this dying political movement. Well, not dying political movement, a last ditch effort in a certain political era, which has just, but yeah, I just, the ability to manipulate ideologies and iconography to represent certain things can do damaging effects, but at the same time, it can be updated in positive ways, where you can utilize different images over time, or adapt an image, not necessarily like turning a bad thing into a good thing, but turning a more neutral thing into a good thing, which we've seen in certain instances, with signs being used in protests and what like.
Yes, and I guess one example that I think we looked at was the projection of Black Lives Matter slogans onto the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond. So we're about out of time, so I'm just going to sum up here. But I thank you so much for coming back, so I could have another discussion of Civil War memory with you, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I hope you guys have all enjoyed as well. And since I talked a lot about the emotions that were in your papers, I'm just so proud to hear you guys talking about these novels and books and materials that we went over. Gave me a sense of accomplishment, that you really had engaged with this material. It was a great class last semester. And I think you brought up some important, the way these memories are really intertwined, and the way they are still so powerful today. So I would say Sarah's point about complacency is extremely important. We can't be complacent that we've agreed upon a unifying memory of the Civil War, because there are these dissonant memories out there that are still so powerful in our society. So before we leave, I just want to remind everyone, 11 o'clock is the keynote speech by Professor Brent Shadle of Virginia Tech University on Ethiopian refugees under the Italian occupation. So thank you very much, and have a good morning.